These are some of the grossest commands given by God in the Bible.
All right, let's see it.
Deuteronomy 20:13 through 14. When the Lord your God hands the town over to you, use your swords to kill every man in the town. But you may keep for yourselves all the women, children, livestock, and other plunder. You may enjoy the plunder from your enemies that the Lord your God has given you. Why do people want to follow this? Every single day, it just absolutely baffles me that there are people who try their hardest to justify literal psychopaths.
Okay, so let's talk about this portion of scripture that this man labels as gross. He starts here at Deuteronomy 20 verses 13 through 14, and he kind of paints it as this picture of Israel is going to slaughter this nation for no reason. But there is a couple of issues with that assumption. Number one is that these are laws being given in the context of ancient war, and God is outlining the parameters for the nation of Israel.
Okay, so it sounds like we're starting off by suggesting that these are socially and historically contingent commandments that were just given to ancient Israel and are not relevant to today. But that doesn't make God's parameters any less gross.
And what this man fails to mention is that in 3 verses earlier, in verse 10, God says, when you approach a city to fight it, offer terms of peace first. So right off the bat, these are parameters for if war is unavoidable because the peace is rejected.
So this is apologetic misinformation. This is just not accurate. And there are a couple different ways this content creator is misrepresenting the data. To begin, they talk about this as if this is what to do if war is unavoidable, as if Israel is just out enjoying their day, and suddenly a city squares up and asks, "Do you bite your thumb at me, sir?" And Israel is put in a position where they have no choice but to either offer terms of peace or fight. And that's not the case at all. Let's take a look at how the NRSV UE renders Deuteronomy 20 verses 10 through 12. When you draw near to a town to fight against it, offer it terms of peace. Now let's just stop there. When you draw near to a town to fight against it, this is about how to engage in a campaign of conquest. This is not about what to do if one day you trip and fall and suddenly war is unavoidable. You are out there picking a fight in Deuteronomy 20. But let's go on. If it accepts your terms of peace and surrenders to you, then all the people in it shall serve you at forced labor. So the terms of peace are not just, shall we shake hands and go our separate ways? The terms of peace are, you will be our slaves. You will be subjugated to us, and you will serve us at forced labor or corvée labor. The two words here, the verbal root avad, and then the word for forced labor, can be understood across a spectrum that runs from corvée labor to just straight up enslavement. Either way, it's not a good thing for the city. This content creator is making it out to be offer them cake or death, but that's not what's going on. It's offer them enslavement or death. And this content creator fails to mention that. And something else they fail to mention is that these verses here, up to verse 14, are part of an early layer of Deuteronomy chapter 20. And I'm sure this content creator is not mentioning it because they're just not aware of it. But starting in verse 15, we have what scholars widely agree to be a secondary editorial layer. Somebody added this on later, and it's reframing exactly what these verses are about. Let's take a look at verses 15 through 18 in the NRSV UE. Thus shall you treat all the towns that are very far from you, which are not towns of these nations here. In other words, this verse is suggesting everything we just said, that's only for the cities that are not a part of the land of Canaan, which the Lord your God is giving to you. That's just for the other towns that are around you when you go out conquesting. Let's go on. But as for the towns of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you must not let anything that breathes remain alive. Indeed, you shall annihilate them, the Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, just as the Lord your God has commanded, so that they may not teach you to do all the abhorrent things that they do for their gods, and you thus sin against the Lord your God. Now here's a little sidebar. The word that is rendered annihilate there in the NRSV UE, that's the word cherem, which is sometimes translated devoted to destruction or something like that. This is a term of art that refers to a kind of ritualistic killing. And the idea in Deuteronomy, in the context of these discussions about the purity of the land, is basically you're killing all the people here as a human sacrifice to purify the land. Now it gets framed as, we don't want them teaching you to do all the bad stuff, but the concept of cherem is basically ritual killing. And in these passages, it is saying every last thing that breathes. The idea here is purify the land through ritual human sacrifice.
Now, let's talk about the language. Kill every man is known to be ancient military legal terminology. What this means is that this command did not mean genocide, it meant total military victory in dismantling of the authority.
So this is simply not true. This is something that people made up, starting in the 18th and the 19th centuries. And with the next clip, you're going to see why it was made up. But just to be clear, there is no such ancient military language. That is something that apologists made up.
And we know this to be true because we have a case study within Scripture itself. In 1 Samuel 15:3, God says, "Go and strike Amalek with total destruction and spare no one." And then later on in 1 Samuel 27, Scripture records that David was going around raiding different cities, and you know who he encountered? The Amalekites. So how could they have been completely destroyed, but then they remain an active people for generations? Because the language at the time was a hyperbolous terminology with an understood meaning.
So this case study betrays the apologetic bob and weave that's going on here. Because when you have a text in one part of 1 Samuel that has God commanding somebody to go and entirely destroy all these people groups and leave nothing alive that breathes and kill every man, woman, and child among these people, and they're supposed to have gone and done it, and then a dozen chapters later, those people are still wandering around. That's a contradiction. And we have the same contradiction in Joshua and Judges. We have places where it'll say, oh yeah, we killed people X, Y, and Z, and we didn't leave anything alive that breathed. We put everything to the sword. We killed everybody. And then 2 chapters later, people X, Y, and Z are still hanging out. That is widely agreed by critical scholars to be evidence of literary seams, where different versions of these stories were stitched together right next to each other. Those are contradictions. But something happened in the 17 and 1800s where you had 3 different factors converging. You have the Enlightenment, you have the rise of critical thought, you have the rise of a lot of literary criticism, and we get a lot of translations of ancient West Asian literature outside the Bible. And so we realize that we've got some contradictions regarding whether or not these genocides actually took place. We also realize that genocide is a bad thing, so we don't like the idea of genocide. And then we also realize that there are all these literary conventions and tropes and idioms in this literature. And so what apologists made up was this way to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. And they started saying, oh, well, the language about genocide is actually just this literary convention, this hyperbolic language. So they didn't actually mean it, and we can tell they didn't mean it because those things that look like contradictions are actually just evidence that the language didn't actually mean it, that the language was just an idiom, that it was just this way of speaking about ancient warfare. And none of that's true. There are no critical scholars from the last century who accept that nonsensical apologetic fabrication. It is something that was ginned up just to excuse God's demand for genocide and also cover over the contradictions that existed between the different accounts of the conquest.
And then when scripture says keeping the women and children, all that means is absorbing them into the household, incorporating them into their lives to avoid revenge later on, and preventing starvation and death after war.
So this is a pretty weak apologetic rationalization for cultural genocide through killing all the men, taking women as concubines, basically sex slaves, and then the forced assimilation of children. It is very similar to what went on with the indigenous peoples of the United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when people would kill a lot of the adults and then take the children and put them with white families, and they would be forcibly assimilated into white culture, and they would be raised to believe that their indigenous origins were savage and uncivilized and things like that. So that was an awful thing that even my own religious tradition did here in the United States with the help of the federal government and a lot of others. And we shouldn't be defending it or coming up with excuses for it when it's in the Bible.
See, scripture forbids the mishandling of the innocent, and it does not celebrate violence, it regulates it.
So ultimately, this video just collapses into another weak apologetic attempt to try to rationalize away the fact that God commands genocide in Deuteronomy chapter 20. And it does so through the imposition of this presupposition of univocality as this grand unifying framework that allows you to center and give priority to the passages that we now know today are morally acceptable, so that all the morally unacceptable passages can be subjugated to those prioritized passages, so that they can be renegotiated and rationalized and rendered morally acceptable. But the problem is, to try to render Deuteronomy 20 morally acceptable, you have to fail to mention a bunch of stuff. You have to say, well, Scripture forbids the mishandling of the innocent, while ignoring the fact that God commands Israel to kill a bunch of innocent men, women, and children in Deuteronomy chapter 20, particularly verses 15 through 18. You have to just ignore that and pretend that, no, this is really this grand social safety net that allows people to be protected unless they refuse to accept these terms of enslavement. And this is just phenomenally weak apologetics that is not taking the data seriously, is profoundly ignorant of the scholarship and the data, and is just trying to make other people who already agree that this all has to be inspired and that this all has to be good feel justified in believing that, even when this chapter is full of atrocities. And I think that's really gross.